A homeless Navy SEAL was freezing in his truck until his wounded K9 dragged him into a broken cabin no one wanted. But the moment he stepped inside, nothing felt abandoned. The dog went straight to the fireplace and wouldn't leave. Minutes later, he uncovered a hidden hatch beneath the floor, and what was buried underneath wasn't just memories. It was military records, maps, letters, and a secret someone was willing to kill for. That cabin wasn't worth $60. It was hiding something far bigger. And the deeper he went, the more he realized he wasn't just inheriting a place. He was stepping into a mission that had never ended. If you want to uncover the truth behind this hidden mission, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. And if you believe this story was meant to be found, comment, Amen. Snow came down over Duluth, like the sky had forgotten how to stop, folding the harbor lights into yellow blurs and turning the empty parking lot behind a closed hardware store into a field of tire tracks, frozen slush, and wind-bent silence. And inside, a rusted blue Ford F-150 with a cracked windshield and an Afghanistan service decal peeling from the rear glass. Owen Maddox slept upright beneath two army blankets that smelled of wet wool, old coffee, and dog fur, his 39-year-old face cut lean by hunger and sleeplessness, his ash-brown hair clipped short out of habit, his beard rough with gray at the chin, his steel-blue eyes closed but never peaceful, because men like him, former Navy SEALs who had spent too many nights listening beyond wire fences, did not truly sleep. They only drifted near waking and waited for the world to make a sound. Judge heard it first, as he always did, because Judge was not just a German Shepherd but a former military K9, with 8 hard years in his bones, sable fur dark along the spine and lighter around the muzzle, amber eyes that missed nothing, one torn ear that never stood straight after a blast outside Kandahar, and a stiff right hip that made winter cruel but never made him careless. And he had been lying across the passenger side floorboard with his body blocking the door like a living barricade, until somewhere beyond the lot, a truck backfired on the icy road with a crack sharp enough to split the night open. And before Owen's mind could remember Minnesota, his muscles remembered Afghanistan. The truck vanished around him in pieces. First, the white breath against the windshield became dust. Then the cold metal under his fingers became the hot frame of an overturned vehicle. Then the distant hum of traffic became broken radio chatter and somebody screaming for a medic through static. And Owen's hand shot toward the flashlight beside the seat with the precision of a man who had survived by moving faster than thought, while his breathing shortened and his eyes opened wide into a darkness that no longer belonged to Duluth, snow, or a man sleeping illegally in a parking lot with 3 VA pills left in a plastic bottle and $11 folded behind his expired driver's license. Judge rose in one controlled motion, not barking, not wasting sound, and pushed his heavy head into Owen's wrist, with the same calm pressure he had used on battlefield nights when panic could get both of them killed. And for several seconds Owen fought the memory without speaking, his jaw locked, his shoulders trembling beneath the blanket, until the smell of wet dog and cold vinyl dragged him back through the smoke, back through the years, back into the Ford, where frost had flowered along the inside edge of the glass, and a yellow parking citation lay pinned beneath the wiper, like a small official insult from a world that charged fees for being poor in the wrong place. "I'm here," Owen whispered, though it was hard to know whether he meant himself or the dog, and Judge kept his head pressed there until Owen's breathing loosened. Then the shepherd gave one tired blink and settled back without ever taking his eyes off the windows, professional even in pain, loyal even when loyalty had cost him half a life of sleep. And Owen reached for the orange prescription bottle in the cup holder, turned it once, heard the 3 capsules tap against the plastic, and put it back unopened, because tomorrow had become a thing he rationed now, the same way he rationed gas, food, warmth, and hope. Morning came gray and mean over the edge of Lake Superior, with wind pushing loose snow across the lot and the city waking behind plow trucks, church bells, and exhaust clouds, and Owen was scraping ice from the inside of the windshield with an old hotel keycard when his phone buzzed against the dashboard. A prepaid phone with a cracked screen and a battery that died faster in cold weather, showing a number he did not know. He almost let it ring out, because unknown numbers usually meant debt, denial, or somebody from an office reading from a script. But Judge lifted his head before the second ring ended, and Owen answered with a voice that sounded older than 39. The woman on the line introduced herself as Grace Harlan, an estate attorney from Whisper Lake, and Grace's voice carried the controlled patience of someone who had spent years speaking calmly across tables where families fought over the dead, while in person, she would prove to be a compact woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pinned low, sharp brown eyes behind narrow glasses, and a manner that was not soft but fair. She told Owen that Silas Maddox, a distant uncle he remembered, only as a weathered Vietnam veteran who had stood alone at 2 funerals and never stayed for lunch, had died 3 weeks earlier and left Owen one remaining property, a lake cabin near Whisper Lake, appraised by the county at $60. By late morning, Owen had driven north through blowing snow with the gas gauge hovering just above empty, Judge sitting upright beside him despite the ache in his hip, until they reached Grace Harlan's second-floor office, above a bait shop and tax service, on Whisper Lake's main street, where Grace studied him without pity when he entered, taking in the worn boots, the old navy jacket, the dog's disciplined stillness, and the way Owen counted exits before choosing a chair, then slid a thin folder, a brass key darkened with age, and a sealed envelope across the desk. Silas, she explained, had lived alone outside town, tall once but bent near the end, with a white beard, a bad left hand from shrapnel, and a reputation for speaking more kindly to dogs than to people, though he had been precise when he amended his will, naming Owen and no one else. When Owen asked why, Grace only tapped the envelope and said Silas had insisted the answer belonged inside. So Owen broke the seal carefully, expecting debt, apology, maybe nothing, and found one sheet of paper with a single sentence written in blocky letters. Do not sell this place if your dog agrees to sleep there. By mid-afternoon, with the key in his jacket and the strange sentence heavier than the folder under his arm, Owen stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, because the Ford needed fuel more than he needed pride, and that was where Nora Whitfield first crossed the edge of his story. A 36-year-old nurse from the small Whisper Lake clinic, slender from years of moving fast between patient rooms, with tired green eyes, dark blonde hair in a practical braid, and a guarded kindness hardened after her husband's death, left her raising a son and fighting to keep a small house. Nora was inside paying for bread and milk when her 12-year-old son Eli, a narrow-shouldered boy with freckles, serious gray eyes, and the quiet courage of a child who had learned too early that adults could break, slipped toward Judge with a sealed bottle of pain medicine for older dogs, and Owen caught the movement immediately, stepping between the boy and the truck, not angry, but alert, the old seal in him measuring hands, distance, intent, while Judge simply watched the child without growling. Eli held the bottle out with both hands, saying his mother worked at the clinic, and his grandfather's old shepherd had needed the same kind of help when the cold got into his hips. And Owen looked at the medicine, then at the boy's patched coat and stubborn little face, and shook his head, because charity had a way of making a man feel naked. But Eli pushed the bottle forward and said, I'm not giving it to you, sir. I'm giving it to the dog. And for the first time that day, Owen had no answer, while Judge leaned his scarred head gently against the boy's sleeve as snow kept falling over Whisper Lake. The road to Whisper Lake narrowed gradually as Owen drove deeper into the northern timber, the asphalt fading into packed snow, and then into a thin, uneven path carved between walls of pine weighed down by winter, and the storm moved in slow sheets across the windshield, blurring distance and flattening the world into gray and white, while the Ford F-150 pushed forward with a tired engine that rattled slightly under strain, and beside him, Judge sat upright, despite the stiffness in his hip, his amber eyes scanning the tree line with a quiet intensity that never truly faded. Because even years after service, a working K9 did not forget how to read silence. And Owen kept both hands locked on the wheel, posture steady, shoulders squared in the way of someone who had spent years driving through worse conditions, with far less room for error, his breathing even, his mind alert, not relaxed, never relaxed, not anymore. The cabin revealed itself slowly through the snowfall, rather than appearing all at once, first as a shadow between tree trunks, then as the outline of a roof sagging under heavy snow, and finally as a structure that looked like it had been abandoned long enough for the forest to begin reclaiming it, with boards nailed across the windows, a chimney leaning slightly as though pushed over time by wind and ice, and a porch whose wood had aged into a brittle gray that spoke of winters endured rather than repaired. and everything about it aligned perfectly with the idea of something worth almost nothing, a place forgotten by people who had moved on or passed away. Yet the stillness around it felt different, not empty but held, as if the land itself had decided to keep this place, rather than let it disappear entirely. Owen cut the engine and listened for a moment, letting the deep silence settle in, that heavy northern quiet that absorbed sound rather than echoing it. And Judge was already moving before Owen opened his door, stepping down into the snow with controlled precision despite the stiffness in his rear leg. His body angled forward, not in caution, but in direction. And instead of circling the cabin or checking the perimeter like he always did in unfamiliar territory, the shepherd walked straight toward the front door, nose low, breathing slow, his posture calm in a way Owen had not seen in years. Because this was not the behavior of a dog assessing threat. It was the behavior of something recognizing a place that did not intend harm, and Owen followed with careful steps, his boots crunching through ice as he moved up onto the porch, while his eyes scanned automatically, measuring angles, noting details, marking exits even before entering. Near the lock, Owen paused, as his gaze caught on something that did not belong to age or weather. 2 scrape marks, carved into the wood beside the doorframe, where the paint had been stripped away recently, revealing lighter wood beneath. And when he crouched closer, he could see the edges were clean enough to suggest tools, rather than decay. Not forced entry, but an attempt. A test. Someone had come here not long ago, and had tried to see what this place held without wanting to leave obvious damage behind. And that alone shifted something in Owen's mind. Because forgotten places did not attract careful visitors, they attracted none at all. And behind him, Judge stood still, waiting. His head slightly tilted toward the door, not tense, not alert, simply present, as if whatever lay inside mattered more than whatever had stood outside. The key from the law office felt colder than it should have as Owen slid it into the lock, the mechanism resisting at first before turning with a dull, heavy click that echoed into the quiet. And when the door opened inward, the smell reached him immediately. Dust layered over old ash, damp wood, and something faint beneath it that carried the ghost of oil and metal, not fresh, not recent, but enough to suggest the place had once been maintained with purpose rather than neglected entirely, and the interior matched the outside in its decay. A single room dominated by a stone fireplace, a broken table near the back, shelves bowed under time, and dust spread across every surface like a final attempt to bury memory beneath stillness. Judge moved past him without hesitation and crossed directly to the fireplace, circling once, before lowering himself onto the floor with a long exhale that carried a kind of relief Owen had never seen from him before. Because this was not exhaustion or caution easing, it was something deeper, something in the dog releasing tension that had been held for too long, and Owen stood watching for several seconds, because Judge did not rest like this anymore. Not in shelters, not in the truck, not anywhere. Since Afghanistan. Yet here, he settled with his body fully relaxed, head resting across his paws, eyes half closed, in a way that spoke of trust rather than fatigue. And Owen felt that shift settle into the room like a quiet answer to a question he had not yet asked. Moving through the cabin, Owen checked each corner with practiced efficiency, his flashlight sweeping across walls, under furniture, along edges where someone might hide. But he found no immediate threat. Only signs of long abandonment, mixed with fragments of something more deliberate. And when he reached the fireplace, his attention settled on a photograph sitting crooked on the mantel beneath a layer of dust, which he wiped away slowly to reveal a younger man in military uniform, standing beside a German shepherd, whose posture mirrored Judge's almost exactly. And beneath the image, faint lettering spelled out the name, Rook, and Owen studied it longer than necessary, because the resemblance between the dog in the photo and the one lying behind him was not exact, but close enough to feel intentional, like a pattern that had not yet been explained. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a sound that did not belong to falling snow, and Owen turned immediately toward the door before stepping back out onto the porch, his eyes tracking the clearing, the tree line, the slope toward the road, and there, near the edge where the forest thickened, he found the marks he had not noticed on arrival. Tire tracks pressed deep into the snow, sharp-edged and recent, leading in and then turning back out again, not softened by time or weather, which meant someone had driven up here recently, stopped long enough to look, and then left, and that detail settled into Owen's awareness like a quiet warning. Because abandoned places did not attract visitors unless there was something worth finding. Night came early beneath the storm, the light fading into a dim gray that turned the cabin colder by the minute, and Owen dragged what remained of a tarp across the least damaged section of floor, while Judge remained near the fireplace, shifting occasionally, but keeping his attention fixed toward the hearth more often than the door. And it was close to midnight when the dog rose and began scratching at the rug in front of the stone, not frantically, but with controlled persistence, and Owen moved immediately, pulling the rug aside to reveal a section of floorboards that looked subtly different, smoother, less warped, and when he tapped them with the flashlight handle, the sound changed. Hollow beneath solid, and that was enough to confirm what instinct had already begun to suggest. Using an iron poker from beside the fireplace, Owen worked the edge of the hidden panel until it gave way with a sharp crack, releasing a breath of cold air that carried the smell of earth and metal, and beneath the floor he found a military footlocker, its green paint chipped and its markings worn, but its structure intact, the kind of container built for transport across war zones rather than storage in forgotten cabins. And when he pulled it free and opened it, the contents revealed themselves layer by layer: dog tags, folded maps, bundled photographs, a radio handset wrapped in cloth, and beneath everything, a worn leather collar with a brass plate engraved with a single name, Rook. And Judge stepped closer then, his nose brushing the edge of the box, as if confirming something he had already understood. Morning returned with a thinner storm and a quieter sky, and Owen had barely begun examining one of the maps when the low rumble of an engine broke the stillness, growing louder as it approached the clearing with deliberate direction rather than passing distance, and Judge rose instantly, posture shifting from rest to guard in one fluid motion as a black SUV rolled into view and stopped near the porch, and the man who stepped out carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to control, tall, composed, wearing a camel-colored coat that spoke more of boardrooms than backwoods terrain, his dark hair touched with gray, his face clean-shaven, his expression measured and polite, but lacking warmth, and as he approached, his eyes moved once across the cabin before settling on Owen, already assessing more than he needed to say aloud. He introduced himself as Preston Vale, his voice smooth and practiced, the tone of someone who had spent years convincing others to see value where they had not before, and he spoke of the property as if it were a burden Owen did not yet understand, listing structural issues, access problems, costs that would follow ownership, all of it framed carefully to lead toward the offer he presented, without hesitation, $45,000 in cash for a cabin officially valued at $60,000, and Owen listened without interrupting, because the numbers did not matter as much as the timing, the speed with which this man had arrived, and the quiet certainty behind his words that suggested he already knew there was something here worth far more than what the papers said. Judge's low growl settled between them before Owen responded, a steady warning that did not escalate, but did not retreat either, and Preston's gaze flicked briefly toward the dog, before returning to Owen with a thinner version of the same controlled smile. And in that moment, Owen understood with complete clarity that the cabin itself was not the target, it was only the cover. And whatever had been hidden beneath that floor, whatever had drawn someone to leave fresh tracks in the snow, that was the real reason Preston Vale had driven through a storm to stand on a broken porch and offer more money than the place should have ever been worth. The storm settled into a quieter rhythm over Whisper Lake that night, not gone, but softened into a steady fall that wrapped the cabin in a kind of isolation that felt almost deliberate, as if the world beyond the trees had agreed to stay away for a while. And inside, the weak fire Owen managed to coax from damp wood pushed a fragile warmth into the room while shadows stretched long across the floorboards, and he sat near the stone hearth with the military footlocker open in front of him, Judge lying close by with his head resting near Owen's boot, his breathing slow and even in a way that still felt unfamiliar. Because this was the first place in years where the dog had allowed himself to sleep without tension, and Owen reached into the locker again, pulling out one of the bundled stacks of letters, tied with worn twine, the paper yellowed at the edges, the handwriting uneven in places, as if written by hands that shook, or men who had not written much before. The first letter he unfolded carried no full name, only initials and a date from nearly 3 decades ago. And, as Owen read, the words came without decoration or apology, written in the plain honesty of someone who had no reason left to impress anyone, describing nights spent sleeping behind gas stations, days lost to alcohol and silence, and then the moment everything changed, when a man named Silas had handed him a key and told him there was a place by the lake where he could stay without questions, and one line stood out, written darker than the rest as if pressed harder into the paper. "You didn't save me with money. You saved me with a locked door, a fire that stayed lit, and a dog that didn't ask me to explain what I couldn't say." And Owen paused there, reading it again, because he understood exactly what that meant. Understood the kind of quiet it took to let a broken man breathe without forcing him to speak. He moved through more letters, each one different in detail but the same in shape, fragments of lives that had drifted to the edge and somehow found their way back here. Men who had worn uniforms in places far from Minnesota and returned home carrying something they could not put down. Some writing about anger, some about guilt, others about nothing at all except the relief of not having to pretend for a few nights. And none of them mentioned money or charity, only space, time, and the presence of a dog who stayed close without demanding anything. And Owen began to understand that Silas had not built this place to fix people. He had built it to hold them long enough that they could decide whether to fix themselves. And that difference mattered more than anything written on paper. Judge stirred slightly beside him, shifting his weight as if responding not to sound, but to something deeper in the room. And Owen glanced down at the shepherd, noticing again the scar along his flank, the stiffness in his movement, the way his ears still reacted to distant noise even in sleep, and it struck him then that Judge had been part of that same pattern all along. A working dog who had never been given the chance to stop working, who had been marked for disposal after injury, and saved only because Owen had refused to let go. And now, here they were, sitting in a cabin built by a man who seemed to understand that some soldiers came home in pieces and needed more than just a place to exist. They needed a place where being broken was not treated as failure. The sound of tires crunching over snow came faintly through the trees sometime after midnight, and Owen's head lifted instantly, his body reacting before his mind caught up. But the vehicle did not approach the cabin. It passed at a distance along the road and faded into the storm, and Judge did not rise, did not growl, only opened one eye briefly before settling again. And that alone told Owen something important, because the dog who had once alerted to the smallest shift in sound now chose stillness here. And that meant, whatever this place was, it held a kind of safety that went beyond structure or location, something older, something tied to the man who had built it and the lives that had passed through it. Morning came with a pale light filtering through the boarded windows, and the cold returned quickly once the fire burned low, and Owen stepped outside to check the clearing, noting the same tire tracks near the edge of the forest, still sharp, still recent. And as he stood there, he heard another engine approaching, slower this time, cautious. And when the vehicle came into view, it was not the black SUV from the day before, but an older pickup coated in road salt and wear. And the woman who stepped out moved with the steady efficiency of someone used to working long hours without complaint, her frame slender but strong, her posture upright despite fatigue. And when she approached, Owen recognized her immediately from the gas station, Nora Whitfield, her green eyes sharper in daylight, her expression guarded but not unkind. Nora carried a small medical kit in one hand and a thermos in the other, and she introduced herself without hesitation, explaining that Eli had told her about the dog and that she had come to check the injury properly, her voice calm, but carrying a firmness that suggested she did not easily take no for an answer. And Owen stepped aside just enough to let her enter, watching carefully, but not interfering as she knelt beside Judge, her movements precise, practiced, the hands of someone who had treated more than just minor wounds. And as she examined the leg, she spoke quietly to the dog, in a tone that balanced authority and gentleness, the kind of voice that reassured without softening the truth. And Judge allowed it, which told Owen more than any introduction could have. Inside the cabin, Nora's attention shifted as she noticed the open footlocker and the photographs spread across the floor, and when her gaze settled on one particular image, she stopped completely, her breath catching in a way that broke her composure for the first time. And Owen followed her line of sight to the photograph he had already seen, the younger Silas standing beside another man, and the German shepherd. But this time, the second figure mattered, a man with a square jaw, dark hair, and eyes that carried the same distant tension Owen had seen in mirrors. And Nora stepped closer, her fingers hovering above the image, before touching it carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. And when she spoke, her voice had changed, thinner, unsteady. "That's my father," she said. "Thomas Whitfield." The room shifted again with that revelation, the quiet taking on a different weight, and Nora explained in short, controlled sentences that Thomas Whitfield had been a Marine who returned from overseas distant, eventually gone altogether when she was still young, leaving behind questions no one had answered, and Owen said nothing, only handed her another bundle of letters, because the pattern had already begun to form, and as Nora read, her expression moved from disbelief to something more complicated, something closer to grief mixed with understanding, because the letters confirmed what she had never been told, that her father had lived here, that he had not abandoned them in the way she had always believed, but had been lost in a different kind of war that followed him home and kept him from returning. They worked through the documents together, Owen reading, Nora cross-referencing dates and names, and piece by piece, a clearer picture emerged. Thomas had stayed at the cabin during a period when his condition had worsened, when he had been unable to function in normal life, and during that time, he had discovered something about the land around Whisper Lake, something involving development interests and legal claims that traced back to companies tied to the Vale name, not Preston directly at first, but his father. And the letters suggested that Thomas had helped Silas move or hide certain records, documents that proved ownership or rights that others might want to erase. And that act had kept him here longer than intended, delaying any return he might have made to his family. As the light faded again toward evening, Judge rose from his place near the hearth and moved toward the fireplace stones with renewed focus, his nose tracing along the edges, as if following a scent that had not yet faded. And Owen watched him closely, recognizing the same deliberate behavior from the night before, and when the dog stopped at one particular section of stone and nudged it with his muzzle, Owen stepped forward, pressing his hand against the surface until he felt the slight give beneath the pressure, and with a careful shift, the stone loosened enough to reveal a narrow space behind it, and inside, tucked deeper than the footlocker, lay a folded map sealed against moisture. Owen pulled it free and opened it across the floor, and both he and Nora leaned in, studying the markings, a detailed survey of the area surrounding Whisper Lake, with one location circled heavily in red near the northern edge of the water, and beside it, written in the same rough hand as the earlier note, were the words North Boathouse Trust Records, and the meaning settled into place without explanation, because whatever Silas and Thomas had hidden, whatever Preston Vale had come looking for, it was not fully here. It was only part of something larger, something waiting out there beyond the trees, beneath snow, and possibly beneath years of silence. The storm rolled heavier over Whisper Lake as the day turned toward afternoon, winds sweeping low across the frozen surface and driving snow sideways in long, relentless sheets that blurred distance and erased edges, and Owen stood just beyond the cabin porch, studying the map again, while Judge remained close at his side, the shepherd's body angled slightly toward the north, as if already aware of where they needed to go, and Nora adjusted the straps of her coat with steady hands despite the tension in her posture, because she had already made the decision to follow through. Not just for the truth about her father, but because something about the cabin had shifted from curiosity into responsibility, and without needing to speak it aloud, the three of them moved toward the truck, carrying with them the quiet understanding that whatever lay at the North Boathouse was no longer just Silas's secret. The drive along the narrow lakeside track was slow and deliberate, the tires struggling against packed snow and hidden ice, while the wind rattled the truck frame and reduced visibility to a moving wall of white, and Owen leaned forward slightly as he drove, scanning the terrain the way he once scanned unfamiliar ground in deployment zones, reading slope angles, tree spacing, possible cover, while Judge watched through the passenger window with that same quiet intensity that had defined his working years, and Nora sat in the back seat, her eyes moving between the map and the frozen lake beyond the glass. Her thoughts caught somewhere between the man she had lost and the man she was beginning to understand, because the idea that her father had chosen to stay hidden rather than return home carried a weight she had not yet decided how to carry. They reached the boathouse near dusk, the structure barely visible through the storm, a low wooden building crouched near the lake's edge with a partially collapsed roof and doors hanging unevenly from rusted hinges, and Owen cut the engine a short distance away, rather than pulling directly up, his instincts telling him not to announce their presence any more than necessary. And as they stepped out into the wind, Judge moved first again, leading them across the snow toward the building, with a limp that had worsened but not slowed his purpose. And Owen noticed fresh impressions near the tree line, faint but present, boot prints partially filled by drifting snow, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. They were not the only ones looking for this place. Inside, the boathouse smelled of rot and cold wood, the floor uneven beneath their weight. But Judge did not hesitate, moving directly toward the far corner where the planks looked older, more worn, and when he began scratching there with controlled insistence, Owen crouched beside him, brushing away debris, until he found the edge of another hidden panel. This one reinforced more heavily than the one in the cabin, and it took both strength and leverage to pry it open, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, the air rising from below colder, but carrying that same faint trace of oil and metal that now felt unmistakably deliberate. The bunker beneath the boathouse was larger than Owen expected, a compact but carefully constructed space, reinforced with concrete and steel beams, clearly built with long-term use in mind rather than temporary storage. And, as his flashlight moved across the interior, the details came into focus. Shelves lined with labeled files, medical supplies sealed against moisture, stacks of journals, maps pinned to the walls, and a central table covered in documents organized with a precision that spoke of discipline rather than chaos. And Nora stepped forward slowly, her breath catching not from fear, but from the realization that this was not a hiding place. It was a system. Something built over years with intention. Among the documents, Owen found the records first, files bearing names, dates, notes written in a consistent hand, tracking individuals who had passed through the cabin, their conditions, their needs, their progress, and then the financial records, detailed accounts showing land leases, timber agreements, and donations accumulated over decades, forming the foundation of something far larger than a single property, and the name repeated across multiple documents. Whisper Ridge Veterans Trust. And when Owen traced the totals listed across different ledgers, the numbers aligned into a single realization that settled heavily into his chest. The value exceeded $5 million. Not in cash alone, but in assets, structured carefully enough to avoid attention, to remain invisible to those who did not know where to look. Nora moved through the files with increasing urgency, searching for her father's name, and when she found it, she stopped completely, her hands tightening around the folder as she opened it slowly, revealing notes written in Silas's hand, describing Thomas Whitfield's condition, his time at the cabin, his involvement in securing documents tied to land ownership disputes. And Owen stepped closer as she read, watching her expression shift through disbelief, grief, and something quieter, something closer to understanding. Because the record confirmed that her father had not abandoned his family out of indifference, but had stayed here longer than intended, to protect something that had already begun to attract the attention of men like Preston Vale. At another table, Owen uncovered a file labeled simply with Judge's designation, and when he opened it, the contents struck harder than he expected. Official documents from military records detailing the dog's injury, behavioral assessment, and the recommendation for termination following the incident in Afghanistan. And beneath that, a signed override form, his own name written there, confirming that he had taken full responsibility to keep the dog alive, despite the risks. And a note in Silas's handwriting clipped to the file read that men who refuse to abandon their dogs rarely abandon people either. And in that moment, Owen understood that the inheritance had never been random. It had been chosen. The sound came from above them, before they had time to process everything they had found. The heavy crunch of boots moving across the boathouse floor, more than one set, deliberate, searching, and Judge reacted instantly, rising despite the strain in his leg, his body shifting into alert readiness, while Owen extinguished the flashlight and motioned Nora back toward the shadows, the tension snapping into place like a memory. Voices filtered down through the boards, rough, impatient, not Preston himself, but men who worked for him, and there was no time left to debate, only to move. Judge lunged first when one of the men began forcing the hatch open, his movement fast despite the injury, drawing attention as he barked sharply and retreated just enough to pull them away from the stairwell. And Owen grabbed Nora's arm, pulling her toward a narrow passage at the back of the bunker marked as an exit route. While above them, the men cursed and followed the sound of the dog, their focus shifting exactly as Judge intended, and they moved quickly through the tunnel, the space tight, air cold and damp, until it opened near the frozen edge of the lake, where wind struck hard enough to steal breath. Eli's presence registered only when he stumbled into view near the exit, his small figure half hidden by the storm, and Nora's voice broke as she called his name, the boy admitting in a rush that he had followed them to help, and before Owen could react further, Eli slipped on the ice near the shoreline, the frozen surface cracking beneath his weight as one leg broke through into black water. And in that instant, Judge moved without hesitation, ignoring the pain in his own body as he lunged forward, teeth catching the fabric of Eli's jacket and pulling with controlled force, until Owen reached them and hauled the boy fully onto solid ground. The storm swallowed everything for a moment after that. The sound, the movement, the fear, until Eli lay shaking but safe against Nora, her arms wrapped tightly around him as she cried openly for the first time, not from fear of what they had found, but from the realization of what had just been saved. And Judge stood beside them, blood darkening the fur around his injured leg, his breathing heavier now, but steady, and Owen looked at him with a quiet understanding that went beyond words, because this dog had not just followed him through war, he had chosen again, in pain, in cold, to protect someone else. Behind them, the voices near the boathouse grew distant, the search shifting away from the shoreline, and Owen knew they had only bought time, not safety, but for now, it was enough. And as the three of them moved back toward the cover of the trees, carrying with them what they had learned and what they had nearly lost, the truth settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The cabin, the bunker, the trust, none of it was accidental. And whatever Silas had built, whatever Thomas had helped protect, it had been worth risking everything for, and now it belonged to Owen, whether he wanted it or not. The courthouse in Ely County stood against a pale winter sky, like something older than the town itself, its stone walls weathered by decades of snow and silence. And Owen Maddox stepped through the front doors with Judge at his side, while cold air followed them in like a reminder of where they had come from. And the hallway smelled faintly of paper, dust, and something official that never quite felt human, and people turned their heads as they passed. Not loudly, not openly, but enough for Owen to notice, because he always noticed, the way soldiers learn to read rooms without needing to ask questions, and Judge moved with him in that same quiet alignment. A large German shepherd of nearly 9 years old, sable-coated with amber eyes that held more awareness than most men in the building, his gait slightly uneven from the injury, but his posture still disciplined, still protective, still working even when no one had given him an order. Inside the courtroom, Preston Vale sat already waiting near the front, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of someone accustomed to control, his silver hair combed neatly back, and his expression composed in a way that suggested confidence rather than patience. And beside him sat his legal team, 2 attorneys whose movements were efficient and rehearsed. One of them a tall, narrow-faced man named Richard Collin, with thin lips and sharp eyes that scanned documents the way a hunter might scan terrain, while the other, a woman named Denise Carter, shorter, broad-shouldered, with a calm voice and an unsettling ability to make harsh arguments sound reasonable, flipped through a folder marked with Owen's name, as if she had been preparing for this moment long before Owen had even known the cabin existed. Grace Harlan stood near Owen's side as they took their seats, her presence grounded and steady. A woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and a posture that carried both authority and restraint, her voice measured in a way that suggested she chose her words carefully, not because she lacked conviction, but because she understood the cost of speaking without precision. And she leaned slightly toward Owen before the proceedings began, reminding him quietly that the truth was enough if he let it stand. And Owen nodded once, though his eyes remained fixed forward, because the room had already begun to press inward on him in ways that had nothing to do with walls. When the hearing began, the judge, Eleanor Whitaker, entered with a presence that silenced the room without effort. A woman in her mid-60s, with sharp features softened only slightly by age, her eyes alert and analytical, her voice firm without being loud, and as she took her seat and called the case forward, the structure of the moment settled into place like a controlled environment, something Owen could understand even if he did not trust it, And for a brief moment, he let himself believe that this might be something he could get through without losing control. That belief did not last long, because Richard Collins stood first, his tone respectful but precise, as he began outlining the case against Owen, framing it not as an attack, but as a concern, and he spoke of instability, of documented PTSD, of housing records that showed Owen had been living out of his truck only weeks prior, of prescription medications issued through the VA, of episodes that suggested unpredictability, and with each point, he built a narrative that sounded reasonable on the surface, a story in which the preservation of the trust required someone more stable, more qualified, someone like Preston Vale. And Owen sat there listening, as his life was translated into a list of weaknesses, each one accurate in its own way, but stripped of context until it no longer resembled the truth he lived with every day. Denise Carter followed, her voice softer but no less effective, as she emphasized the value of the Whisper Ridge Veterans Trust, the millions tied to it, the legal complexities involved in managing such assets, and she questioned whether a man still navigating his own recovery could realistically be expected to protect something so large. And the room remained quiet as she spoke, not because people agreed, but because the argument had been constructed to sound inevitable, as if the conclusion had already been decided, and they were simply moving toward it in a polite, orderly way. The sound came without warning, a metal chair shifting sharply against the floor in the back of the courtroom, the scrape echoing louder than it should have, and for a fraction of a second the room disappeared, replaced by something older, hotter, louder, and Owen's breathing shortened as his body reacted before his mind could catch up, his shoulders tightening, his vision narrowing, and then Judge moved, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with practiced certainty, stepping closer and pressing his weight firmly against Owen's leg, anchoring him, grounding him, the contact steady and unyielding, and Owen felt it, the present returning in layers, the courtroom reforming around him, the sound fading back into something harmless, and when he looked up again, the room was watching, not with fear but with something quieter, something closer to recognition. Nora Whitfield stood next, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the witness stand, but her voice steadied as she began to speak, describing her father, Thomas Whitfield, not as the man she had believed him to be, but as the man she had discovered through the letters hidden beneath the cabin. And she read from one of those letters, her voice breaking only once as she reached the part where her father described the cabin as the only place he had ever felt safe after the war, the only place where he had not been judged for what he could not explain. And as she spoke, the courtroom shifted again, the narrative no longer about Owen's instability, but about the purpose of the trust itself, about what it had been built for and who it had served. Grace Harlan followed with documentation, original records of the Whisper Ridge Veterans Trust, legal filings that predated Preston Vale's involvement by years, evidence that demonstrated a pattern, attempts to undervalue the land, to obscure its true worth, to position it for acquisition under the guise of development. And she presented these facts without embellishment, allowing them to stand on their own weight. And for the first time, Preston's expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough for Owen to notice, because again, he always noticed. When it was his turn, Owen stood slowly, not because he needed time to think, but because he needed to ensure his body would follow his intention, and he did not raise his voice when he spoke, did not attempt to argue in legal terms he did not fully understand, but instead said what he knew to be true, that no one had wanted the cabin when it was nothing more than a place for broken men to survive the winter, that no one had cared about its value until money was attached to it, and that he did not need to be wealthy to understand what Silas had built, only to be willing to protect it. And the room remained silent when he finished. Not because the argument was complex, but because it was simple, in a way that could not be easily dismissed. Judge Whitaker leaned back slightly after the final statements, her eyes moving between the parties before her, and when she spoke, her decision was measured, deliberate, a temporary ruling that protected the trust from external interference, that restricted Preston Vale's access to the property, and that recognized Owen Maddox as the acting steward of the Whisper Ridge Veterans Trust until a full investigation could be completed, and the words settled into the room with a weight that felt both immediate and incomplete, because it was not an end, only a pause. Outside the courthouse, the cold felt different than it had that morning, sharper but clearer, and Owen stood for a moment on the steps with Judge beside him, Nora, a few feet away, speaking quietly with grace. And he knew that nothing had been resolved entirely, that Preston would not stop, that the fight had only changed shape. But for now the line had held, and as Judge shifted his weight slightly against Owen's leg again, steady, present, Owen allowed himself a single breath that felt almost like relief. Because for the first time since the cabin had entered his life, he was not just surviving what came next, he was choosing it. Weeks passed over Whisper Lake, not as a sudden change, but as a slow, deliberate shift that settled into the bones of the land the same way snow melted inch by inch under a reluctant sun, and the cabin that had once stood sagging and abandoned at the edge of the forest began to take on a different kind of presence, not transformed into something new or polished, but restored just enough to hold its shape, its purpose, its memory. And Owen Maddox moved through it each morning with the same quiet discipline he had carried through years of service, checking doors, stacking wood, reinforcing beams. But now those actions were no longer about survival alone. They were about maintaining something that mattered beyond himself. The stone fireplace remained exactly as Silas had left it, its surface still marked by smoke stains and years of use, and above it hung the photograph Owen had cleaned that first night. Silas standing beside the old military shepherd Rook, both of them staring toward a camera that had captured more than just an image, and the worn K9 collar rested nearby, not displayed like a relic, but placed within reach, as if it still belonged to something living, and the carved marks along the wooden beams, initials, dates, small fragments of names left behind by men who had passed through, were left untouched. Because Owen understood now that removing them would be the same as erasing proof that those men had ever been there at all. Whisper Ridge Veterans Trust moved from hidden structure to something recognized, not loudly, not with press or announcements, but through quiet confirmation, paperwork filed, accounts stabilized, and the name Whisper Ridge House began to appear in small, careful ways among veteran outreach networks, passed along not through advertising, but through word of mouth, and people began to arrive, one at a time at first, then more steadily. Men who carried the same look Owen had seen in his own reflection, the distant focus, the controlled breathing, the awareness of exits, even in safe spaces. And with them came dogs, old K9 units, no longer fit for service. Shepherds with stiff hips and faded strength, mixed breeds that had learned discipline without ever finding a home. Nora Whitfield moved into the rhythm of the place as naturally as if she had always belonged there. Her work as a nurse shaping itself into something broader than clinical care, because she treated more than wounds. She watched for silence that lasted too long, for hands that shook when no one spoke, for the subtle signs of men who were slipping away without anyone noticing. And her appearance carried a quiet resilience, her frame still slender but stronger now, her movements confident, her voice steady, in ways that came not from training alone, but from the understanding she had earned through loss. And Eli remained close to her. A boy of 12, with restless energy and wide eyes that had learned too early what fear felt like, but who now found purpose in small tasks, carrying water, stacking wood, reading aloud to dogs that lay with their heads resting against his knees, as if the sound of his voice mattered. Owen noticed the changes in himself slowly, not as sudden relief, but as an absence of something that had once been constant. The nights when he woke still came. The memories did not disappear, but they no longer held him in the same way, because when he opened his eyes now, he did not find cold metal or empty darkness. He found walls that held warmths, the steady breathing of dogs nearby, the faint sound of movement from another room where someone else was already awake, and those small details anchored him in ways no medication ever had, grounding him in the present without forcing him to forget the past. Judge recovered the same way the cabin did, gradually, without announcement, his limp easing over time as the wound healed, his movements regaining strength without losing the caution that had kept him alive. And one morning in early March, when the snow outside had softened enough to reveal patches of earth beneath, Owen realized something that stopped him where he stood. The dog had slept through the entire night without waking, without shifting, without that low, protective growl that had once filled the hours between midnight and dawn. And as Owen stood there watching him, he understood that the same had happened to him, because for the first time in years, he had slept without being pulled back into something he could not control. The cabin held more people now, Not crowded, not chaotic, but alive. Voices moving through the rooms in low conversations, the sound of laughter appearing occasionally in places where silence had once settled too heavily. And among them was a man named Frank Delaney, broad-shouldered and weathered, a former mechanic who had lost both his shop and his sense of direction after returning from overseas. His hands still steady when given tools, his voice rough but warm when he spoke, and he had taken it upon himself to repair what he could, fixing doors, reinforcing walls, treating each task as something worth doing properly rather than quickly. And nearby, an older Labrador named Rosie, her fur graying, her movements slow but gentle, had found a place beside Judge near the fireplace, leaning against him during storms as if trusting him to hold steady. On a morning when snow fell lightly rather than violently, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a young man standing uncertainly near the porch steps, his posture tense, his shoulders slightly hunched as if prepared to turn away at any moment. And beside him stood a thin shepherd mix, its coat uneven, its ribs faintly visible beneath the fur, its eyes alert but cautious. And the man introduced himself as Ryan Cooper, his voice hesitant but controlled, a former Army medic who had drifted from place to place after discharge, unable to settle, carrying a quiet exhaustion that showed in the way he held himself, not broken, but worn. And when he spoke, he asked the question simply, without expectation, "Are you the owner of this place?" Owen stood in the doorway for a moment before answering, his eyes moving past Ryan into the cabin behind him where Nora poured coffee into mismatched cups, where Eli knelt beside Rosie with a book open in his hands, where Judge lay stretched near the fire with his head resting calmly against the floor, the flames casting light across the photograph of Silas and Rook. And in that moment, the answer became clear, in a way that required no explanation, because ownership no longer felt like the right word for what this place had become. And when Owen looked back at Ryan, his voice was steady, quiet, but certain. "No," he said. "I'm just the one who keeps the door open." Ryan stepped forward after that. Not quickly, not confidently, but enough. And the dog followed him, hesitating only once before crossing the threshold into warmth, and the door closed behind them with a soft sound that carried more weight than it should have, because it marked the beginning of something rather than the end. And outside, the snow continued to fall gently across Whisper Lake, covering tracks, softening edges. But inside, the light remained steady, held by people who understood its value because they had once lived without it. The cabin that had once been valued at $60 stood now not as something measured by price, but by purpose. A place where men who had been overlooked found space to exist without explanation, where dogs who had been discarded found rest without expectation. And Owen understood that what he had inherited had never been land or money. It had been a responsibility, a continuation of something built quietly, by a man who had seen the same darkness and chosen to answer it with something simple, something human. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth and the voices around him settled into the rhythm of another day, Owen allowed himself to stand still for a moment. Not as a soldier waiting for the next command, but as someone who had finally found a place where staying mattered more than leaving. Sometimes God does not change your life all at once. He gives you a place, a moment, or a person that helps you breathe again. What looks small can be a miracle, and what feels like the end may just be the beginning of something greater. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and type Amen if you believe in second chances. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path.